Hello, everybody. We're doing a show again on Socrates, the man who asks the good questions. And of course, for me, as the interviewer on this show, it puts particular pressure on me. My guest is Agnes Callard, a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, and she has a fascinating new book out, Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life. Just before we started, Agnes confessed to me that it was much harder to ask the questions than answer them. So, Agnes, maybe I'll reverse this. What question would you ask yourself if you were interviewing yourself about this new book?
That's really hard because I have to decide which aspects of myself I'm like unfamiliar with. I have to figure out what I don't know in this weird possible world in which I'm interviewing myself. The theme of my book, not the theme, the central claim of my book is that you can't really ask yourself questions. That's not a thing we can do, at least not when it comes to important questions. That all of us have really important blind spots in just the most important places. So all the things where I most need to be asked about those points, those are exactly the points where it just wouldn't occur to me to ask the question. So I guess what I would say is that I would just predict a very boring interview.
Well, I hope this won't be boring. Socrates, of course, is an important figure, perhaps the foundational figure in not just Western philosophy, Western political thought and culture more broadly. Are you presenting Socrates then as a quintessentially social figure in contrast to the later philosophers who retired into themselves?
I'm not sure they did so much retire into themselves. That is, I think philosophers have sought social interaction with other philosophers pretty much throughout history. But I do think that they don't always foreground that in their presentation of their ideas. Now, with Socrates, there is no Socratic presentation of his ideas. Socrates didn't write down any of his own theories. The reason why we have any grasp at all of what Socrates thought and what he did is that other people chose to do that because people who met him, at least some people who met him, kind of recognized the encounter with a world historical phenomenon, and they just didn't want that to be forgotten. And that's why we've got the record of Socrates. So I guess, though, what I think is that Socrates' thought, and as presented by those other people, chiefly here I'm thinking of Plato, Socrates' thought helps us understand why intellectual interaction is first and foremost a social interaction.
And I wonder whether the fact that Plato presents us Socrates, most of us know Socrates through Plato's work. They're such different figures. Plato seems to be someone, again, without wishing to be too crude, I mean, someone with answers, whereas Socrates is the man of questions. So while some people may be skeptical that Socrates is presented by Plato, who isn't particularly Socratic, might that actually be a good thing? Might that be a work of philosophy?
I think it's very striking that Plato doesn't present himself at all. That is, Plato doesn't show up in the dialogues. Presumably there were many encounters in which Socrates was talking to Plato, right? These were real people who actually met, who actually interacted. And Plato chooses to show us Socrates talking to Laches, to Gorgias, to Protagoras, to Hippias. To so many people, and not to Plato. So Plato recedes in a way from the narrative. He seems to feel comfortable that way in not putting himself first and at the front of the story. I think when we say Plato had answers, what we're doing is we're making inferences from certain Platonic dialogues, some of the later ones, where we sort of see a Platonic theory being built. And I agree with that. I don't have any objection to that. But even that is, it's a bit different than Plato having given us a treatise. The Laws is something maybe a little closer to a treatise, but a lot of the dialogues that are presenting us what we think of as the canonical Platonic theory don't take a treatise form.
everybody, of course, or most of our audience, I hope, will know the Republic, where I'm not sure if Socrates makes the case for philosopher kings, but he certainly discusses it. And
he makes the case for sure.
But wasn't that Plato's idea rather than Socrates? Plato would have been much more comfortable in a world of philosopher kings than Socrates himself.
Yes, I think so. So I think that there's a kind of traditional chronology of the dialogues that Plato wrote, where the early ones are taken to represent the historical Socrates, at least to a greater degree. And then the later ones, it's seen as more sort of license that you can go digging in those for the views of Plato. A lot of people, and I sort of agree with the consensus here, one of the places they will draw the line is after book 1 of the Republic. So book 1 of the Republic, it's still historical Socrates, but books 2 onward, we're getting something more like the views of Plato. But even there, the views of Plato are not presented as a treatise. They're presented in the form of a conversation where Socrates has to convince these people, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are reanimating the challenge posed by Thrasymachus, that actually it's good to be a good person. And he does that by way of describing an ideal city. And at the end of the day, it turns out that that ideal city is going to be ruled by philosophers.
I don't want to turn this, Agnes, into another conversation on contemporary America, but you talked about Thrasymachus, a striking figure at the beginning of the Republic, and I think he shows up in some of the other dialogues. Is Thrasymachus, with his focus on power and his dismissal, I guess, of the morality or the good life of philosophy, is he the anti-Socrates?
I think there are a lot of different anti-Socrateses. So there's a figure, and yes, you can identify Thrasymachus, and I think you can also identify Callicles in the Gorgias, who's a very similar character to Thrasymachus. A kind of nihilist who is skeptical about conventional morality. I think that these are people who have, very different ethical views from the views of Socrates. But, if you have someone like Ion, who is glorifying the poets as being the ultimate sources of wisdom, that's another way to be the anti-Socrates. If you have someone like Euthyphro, who thinks, oh, I'm a prophet and I have like direct access to divine wisdom, that's another way to be the anti-Socrates. It turns out there's just a lot of ways to be the anti-Socrates. There's a lot of people who are the opposite of Socrates.
So this is a question that I'm sure you're always dealing with, and of course you deal in your text. Did Socrates have views, or when we think about Socrates, should we think about a way of life when we think about him? For many people, he's this man who would sit in the square and ask people questions, debate, question. Did he have any views? Did he have a philosophy, if that's the right word?
Yes, he had views, and yes, I think he had a philosophy. I think those are not exactly the same claim. And yes, he also was pursuing philosophy as a way of life. So I think it's not that hard to find his views because they get repeated over and over again in the dialogues. There are things like, everyone desires the good. Weakness of will is impossible. It's better to have injustice done to you than to do injustice. It's better to be good than to appear good. I could just keep listing them. There are lots of views, and in certain dialogues, like for example, in the Gorgias, they actually get listed. Here are Socrates' views, and Socrates goes so far as to say they have been tied down with arguments of iron and adamant. I don't know how much more emphatic you could get with someone having views than having them generally be able to say pithily in a sentence, appearing over and over again in the text, being argued for repeatedly, and having them be flagged for the reader by having them be repeated as having been tied down. So for sure he had views. It's a strange thing about the encounter with Socrates that so many people think he didn't have views. And I have thoughts about why people think that, but he very clearly did have views. I think that he thought that having views of a certain kind and testing them and inquiring into them was a way of life. That was his way of life. So if you want to know his way of life, you can kind of list those views and they tell you something important about his way of life. And having a philosophy, I think in a way that's a bit anachronistic. He made it the case that a philosophy was something you could have because that sort of didn't exist before him. So it's like he generated the very idea of having a philosophy. And if you think about these texts that we have, it's just a extremely remarkable fact that these texts, which are conversations, that is, they're not actual recorded conversations, they are dramatizations of conversations. They represent a new genre, the Socratic dialogue, that was invented by people in response to Socrates. That is, he was such a remarkable guy that a bunch of people, not just Plato, we mostly lost these texts, but we have Plato's and Xenophon's. A bunch of people were like, we're just going to create a genre. It's like creating fiction or something. They created the Socratic dialogue, which is Socrates talking to some guy. That was just a thing. That was a kind of text you would create after Socrates because it was so remarkable that he had what he had done and what he had made himself into.
Is there, Agnes, a contradiction with the fact that Plato wrote all this stuff down and Socrates himself was ambivalent about the value of the written word as opposed to the spoken word? In other words, should we be reading about Socrates at all in terms of the medium? Is it by definition anti-Socratic?
I think a bit, yes. So it's not a contradiction. Plato and Socrates were different people. And Plato could well have disagreed with Socrates about some of his claims. He might have thought those claims of Socrates are worth getting out there and, representing him as asserting, even if I, Plato, disagree with them. That's pretty Socratic, actually. The thought that Plato would only ever have Socrates say things that he, Plato, agreed with would not be so Socratic. So I don't think it's a contradiction, but I do think it's an interesting tension. And I will say that I teach the Socratic dialogues all the time, and I find that students get the most out of them, not when they're reading them, but when they're discussing them, when we argue about them, when we take an argument and we put the premises on the board and we start testing various premises and saying, okay, is this one right? Is this one right? What's the problem with this one? Does the conclusion actually follow? Is this word being used ambiguously? That's us engaging Socratically with the Socratic argument. And I think a lot of the value of the dialogues is to be found there.
The subtitle of the book, Agnes, is "The Case for a Philosophical Life." You noted earlier that Socrates believed in the moral life. Are those the same things? What exactly is a philosophical life?
I think that in a way, it would be a bit presumptuous to just identify the philosophical life with the moral life. Though, if Socrates is right, they are connected. Socrates thinks that the goal of life is knowledge, and the way that you be a good person is to keep that in mind in everything that you do. And that's going to have certain kinds of entailments as to how you treat the people around you. You treat them as fellow inquirers. Maybe the simplest and most straightforward one is like you never get revenge or retaliate no matter what. And there's quite a bit of the book that's about that point. But basically, the way that I sort of position the philosophical life as a way of life is just to say, let's look at what it's the alternative to. That is, what are the other possibilities? What are the other kinds of lives that there are besides the philosophical life? And what I argue in the book is that, we live in a world where there are two dominant ethical theories that give you a recipe for a kind of life to live. One of them is utilitarian. Okay, so the utilitarian life is the calculative, maximizing life that tries to, make your behavior consistent over time and also make your behavior and your pursuit of benefit and well-being consistent with that of other people, right? So achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the utilitarian principle. So that's one life that you could live, right? Achieve as much good as possible, bring about as much happiness as possible for everybody. That's the utilitarian life. There's another life which says, do your duty, follow the moral rules, treat other people with respect, never use anyone as a means, treat them always as an ends in themselves. So the utilitarian life is associated with the philosopher John Stuart Mill, also Bentham and Sidgwick, but Mill is the guy who wrote the book called Utilitarianism. The The second life, we can call it the Kantian life because it's associated with Immanuel Kant. And it basically says that that rationality is a matter of following rules that admit of universalization. So like the golden rule or something is a good gloss, let's say, on the Kantian life. The Kantian life says, don't do something where it wouldn't make sense for everybody to behave the way that you're behaving. Don't make an exception of yourself. And these are two different prescriptions. Saying bring about as much good for everybody and follow the rules, do your duty, are not the same. And one classic forum in which that difference shows up for us are trolley problems. So in a trolley problem, you're often going to be in a situation where you can either achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, or you can avoid using someone as a means, but not both. Okay, so those are two lives you could live.
And that's important. Of course, the trolley problem is particularly relevant in our age of self-driving cars. Wasn't that Elizabeth Anscombe who introduced it?
Yes, I believe that's correct, that Anscombe introduced it. And there's a third option here, namely, utilitarianism associated with Mill, and also more distantly with ancient Epicureanism. Kantianism associated with Kant, more distantly with ancient Stoicism. And then there's what's called virtue ethics, which draws on Aristotle. And it sort of says, well, you can kind of achieve both these things at once. You can achieve both following the law, like behaving in a law-like way, where you respect your community and the kind of creature you are, and also bring about the greatest good for the greatest number by pursuing what's noble. That's Aristotle. Okay, so the Socratic life, the philosophical life, I'm introducing it as an alternative to these three other lives. That is the life of utility, the life of respect or duty, and the life of pursuing the noble, the kalan. And what I'm saying is another thing a life could be about is knowledge, and knowledge is sufficient to really organize a whole life. It tells you, the pursuit of knowledge tells you how to do romance, how to do politics, how to think about death. It gives you comprehensive ethical guidance.
Isn't there something utilitarian, though, about this recipe? You're presenting Socrates as someone who can help you figure out your romantic problems or the meaning of life or all these other questions. Doesn't that strikes me as being quite utilitarian in maximizing our happiness?
So, sometimes utilitarian just means kind of helpful or useful. And in that sense, sure. But the way in which Socrates helps you deal with your romantic life is very distinctive. It's distinctively Socratic. And it's not like, let's say your problem with your romantic life were that you think about yourself too much or something. And then you might have a therapist who's like, just try thinking about other people. That'd be kind of utilitarian. What Socrates does is he tries to show you that romance isn't what you think it is. The thing you are trying to get out of romance is not really a kind of attachment to another person. The attachment to another person is actually kind of instrumental to the thing you're really after. So it's like he rewrites the story of romance for you. And the way that he does that is by sort of first having you notice that the way that you behave about romance is crazy. It's what you would think of as crazy, insane, if you did it with respect to anything else. There's kind of a knot there that has to be untangled. An example I give in my book is like if somebody behaved about food the way we do about romance, like if they were banging on the doors of a restaurant and the restaurant is closed and you're like, you can't go in there, they've locked it. And they're like, but I have to get in. And you're like, well, but what about all these other restaurants that are open just nearby? And they're like, no, I have to go in this one. And you say, is the food there like so amazing? And they're like, no, I hate it. At a certain point, you would say there's something wrong with this person. Like, what is going on? But that's just the way we behave when we're like, it's late at night and we're texting our ex who we said we hate and we never ever want to see their face again. And they made us totally miserable. And we're somehow drawn. Our friends are like, no, stop it. That's just commonplace. It's commonplace with romance. And Socrates thinks you've normalized something that is really crazy. So Socrates says love is a kind of madness. And he wants to help you untangle that knot. And so it's not straightforwardly utilitarian because it requires you to do a lot of interpreting to see that what you want is not what you think you want.
You have your own podcast, Minds Almost Meeting, and I think you co-host it with your ex-husband.
No,
and I'm
that's not correct.
Oh,
Robin and I have never been married. Robin's an economist. He lives in DC. I live in Chicago.
What did I read about? Am I wrong that you've done some stuff with your ex-husband, or am I fantasizing?
Yes, I did an event on the philosophy of divorce with my ex-husband.
Right.
That event, that's online, but it's not a podcast.
I apologize if Robin's watching. You're not married to Agnes, but my question, Agnes, is more: are you living? I mean, you seem to have digested a lot of this stuff. You talked to your ex-husband in a responsible way about the value of divorce and marriage. Are you living the philosophical life? Have you digested all this stuff? Are you a model in a sense?
I definitely try to. And I find that there are a lot of fights in my life where I say to myself, wait, take a step back. Like, there's a question here. There's a question you guys are trying to figure out. And this is the only person that can help me with that question. It's time to be cooperative because I need their help. So I definitely, I sometimes consciously reach for this. I think more broadly, there's a thing I want to say about philosophy, which is I think that the point of philosophy, at least of the practical part of philosophy, is that there's a lot of stuff that we're doing in our lives that we're not very clear on what it is that we're doing or why we're doing it. And the point of philosophy is that if we get clear on it, we'll do it better. It's like having a sense of what your target is so you know how to aim at it. So my first book was called Aspiration. And I thought, hey, here's a thing that human beings do, but there doesn't really exist a philosophical theory about it. If we understand it, we'll be able to do it better. And this book is me trying to come to terms with the philosophical life because I think if I understand what it is and why it's valuable, I'll be able to do it better. I'll be able to live it more fully. I don't think I can say that I'm completely instantiating it at every moment of my life, but I do think that in many crisis moments, it's what I reach for.
What would Agnes, or maybe Socrates, what would they think, or what do they think of the self-help industry? Is this the antithesis of the philosophical life? Because the more you talk about it, it sounds like, in a sense, intelligent self-help.
So, remember when I said that there's many opposites to Socrates? I think self-help is one of the opposites, just in the simple sense that the message of my book is that you cannot help yourself. You are defective. You are not able to think. You're not good at reasoning. You're not able to figure out the answers to most important questions on your own. You don't know things that you think you do know. And you can't dig yourself out of that hole. You need help from other people. So it's like an other help book. I think that I just don't know that much about self-help when we get to it more concretely. And it might just be that there are like tips and tricks that people can teach you so that your life runs smoother than it was running up until that point. And I'm not going to deny that that can happen. But I guess I think at the deepest points, we seem to need other people. And even forgetting about philosophy, even therapy, like if you really got problems, you probably can't be your own therapist. You probably actually need some other person who is a therapist to be your therapist.
So a lot of people are going to be listening and watching to this and thinking, well, I agree with Agnes, but my problem is I don't know where to find other people who ask good questions. I went down to the square yesterday and I didn't find Socrates. Where are we supposed to find these people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you about my first experience trying to produce an answer to that question. I talk about it in the book. It was when I was in college and I was first like getting super into Socrates. And, as I got more and more excited about Socrates, I tried to connect to him in a lot of different ways. So I studied ancient Greek. I studied Greek history. I, of course, read all the dialogues. I wrote papers on the dialogues, took classes on the dialogues, had little discussion groups with my friends. None of that satisfied me because I didn't just want to like study Socrates. I wanted to like be Socrates. So I thought, well, I'll just do what he did. You know, what Socrates did was he went to the Agora, which is like the marketplace of Athens, and he would have these philosophy conversations. And so I thought, well, I was at undergrad at the University of Chicago. And so I thought, well, what's like the Agora in Chicago? I thought the steps in front of the Art Institute. That's where people hang out. This, by the way, I don't know if you've been to the Art Institute recently. Now there are 2 entrances, but
no, I mean, I've been to the campus, but I don't know the place you're talking about.
Okay, you don't know the Art Institute at downtown. You've been to Chicago.
Oh, you mean in Chicago?
Yeah, this is not on campus.
Oh, okay. So
it's
go
like
on.
one of the best museums in the world.
Right.
So anyway, at the time when I was an undergrad, there was only one entrance. So people would really congregate in front of on those steps. But there are these 2 lions, and in between the lions, there are these big steps. So that's where I went. And I went up to people and I asked them, do you want to have a philosophical conversation? So I'm like, what, 19, 20 at the time? Okay, the first surprise was people said yes. I actually expected them to say no. I expected them to be like, no, why would I want that? Or I don't know you or whatever. But they said yes, most of them. And then I would say, what is art? Or what is the value of art? Or what is the meaning of life? Now, when this happens in a Socratic dialogue, there's a specific way that it goes, which is that the interlocutor says, oh, Socrates, that's easy to tell you. I could give you the answer. Anyone could answer that question. It's not hard to answer. And Socrates is like, okay, so go. And then the person gives an answer, and then Socrates explains why it's not a good answer. And then they try another answer, and Socrates explains why it's not a good answer. And sort of as they go along, they are inquiring into the nature of the thing by Socrates repeatedly sort of correcting their answer and, making progress in that way. Okay, none of that is what happened to me. These conversations just did not get going. People seemed uncomfortable, unhappy, kind of scared of me, really wanting to get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. I'll just tell you that by way of saying I'm very sympathetic to the thought, how do we make this happen? Because when I first tried to make it happen, it did not work. I tried it with a number of people. I just failed. I was not good at being Socrates. And I think really, I'm now, I just turned 49 years old, right? So it's been 20 years since that. And for 20 years, I have tried to figure out, how do I do this thing? How do I do it without scaring people, without putting them off, where I'm actually making progress, where I'm actually inquiring with them? And what I found is that it's a little hard to put your finger on it, but people might be better at doing this once they read my book, that inside of our interactions with the people that are already around us, the people that we already know, so our spouses and friends and kids, especially kids, inside those interactions, there's a set of conversations that we have with those people where there's a little bit more space in those conversations than we realize. It's like there's like a hidden back room inside of every conversation. There's space where you could go. How do you go there? So often it's just asking someone for a bit more of an explanation for something that they've said, or the other way being, they ask you for an explanation, and instead of getting defensive, you think to yourself, oh, this is my chance to figure out whether my explanation really works or not. It's sort of taking an extra step to be like, here's why what you're saying doesn't make sense to me. So basically, my book describes the structure of Socratic conversation. It describes what you have to do, but it's going to be up to the readers to figure out which parts of their lives are closest already to that structure, such that they can just expand a bit in that direction. I will just grant that it doesn't work to try to go from like 0 to Socrates super fast.
Agnes, I'm just back from Chile and Germany, 2 countries far apart, but they both prioritize public space. In fact, I've spent some time in the central square in Santiago in Chile, where I'm not sure if there are any Socrates, but it was certainly an environment where one could imagine Socrates. You give the example of sitting outside in Chicago and asking strangers questions. Americans seem very uncomfortable in public space, perhaps understandably, given the levels of crime and insanity and all the rest of it. How essential then, in terms of the philosophical life or the Socratic life, is public space? You presented in terms of your explanation where you can do it with friends, you can do it privately, you can do it at home, presumably you can do it on the internet. But is the ideal place the public sphere, the agora?
Socrates does it actually in a variety of places. So some of them are public, but sometimes he's just in someone's house. So Socrates is going to take every opportunity he can get, right? He's not waiting for the ideal one. But I think that people have actually told me that if I tried this now, it would work a lot better. And forget that, like, I'm somewhat famous and people know who I am. I assume that wasn't the case. They say because of TikTok, people are actually pretty used to, like, strangers coming up to them. Apparently there's a TikTok thing, show me your apartment, where people walk up to a stranger and say, will you take me to your apartment and show it to me and I'll put it on TikTok? And people do this. So it actually might not go off so badly these days, because we actually have more sort of social customs that involve interacting with strangers. And, like, at the very least, if I were saying that I would put it online, then they might be like, oh, okay, this is kind of performative. But I guess I do think that at the end of the day, we want to be able to have some public interactions of this kind. Maybe that's not the first place that's going to get become hospitable to philosophy, but it, I think, should be our goal, that it is a place that where eventually we'll feel comfortable having philosophy.
You mentioned TikTok, of course, an internet platform, a social media platform. I'm sure people have asked you this question before on Socrates and AI. If you were given a large amount of money by OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, could you create an app, an AI app, which replicates Socrates? Or is that by definition impossible? And in many ways against the whole spirit of whatever Open Socrates is, even if it was an open source product?
I think that it makes sense to me that you could feed all of the Socratic dialogues into AI in ancient Greek, let's say, and have it generate some more along the lines of these, especially if you also fed in all of the scholarship that has existed, studying these dialogues from the ancient period through the, medieval, early modern, et cetera, today. That's a lot of thought that's been put into the kind of text that a Socratic dialogue is. And I just wouldn't be surprised if, with enough work on this, the AIs could give us another one. So if what you want to know is, could the AIs produce a Socratic dialogue that really kind of rings true to us? Probably yes. If what you want to know is, could the AI become Socrates for you to interact with? I think that's a taller order. And the reason is, I tend to think, I'm not saying it could never happen, but I think it would happen much later than, like, AI therapy. We can compare it to therapy, right? We can compare the idea of having an AI therapist is something that I see floated. And the thing about therapy is that, it's important that there's another person in the room and that person is responding to you and is helping you figure out what's going on with you. But it isn't actually important, at least for many kinds of therapy, that the therapist have desires of their own and a curiosity of their own, right? That is, they're supposed to actually keep that stuff outside the room. Like, say you mention that in therapy, that you went to a particular movie, and say they're curious whether you like that movie or not. They can't just ask that, because they're not supposed to be themselves, and they're just supposed to be your therapist. They're supposed to be, in a way, a tool that you use to understand yourself. And a good therapist knows how to make themselves into that, and knows how to take their own interests and desires and passions and whatever and keep them outside of the therapy room. That's what it is to be a professional. Okay. And I think because of that, that sort of suggests, in a way, the therapist doesn't need to be another person, because they don't need to have desires. But I think the philosopher the philosophical interaction kind of essentially involves two people who each have their own sets of desires. That is, who each want to know things. And so what we would need is an AI that wanted to know things. I think if you had that, making them be Socratic would actually be relatively easy, because a lot of what gets in the way of us being Socratic are some of our base passions that we could just not have in the AI. But it's just very apparent to me when I interact with AIs that they don't want anything, and that really skews and affects the interaction that I have with them.
Yeah, although I think an AI that wants something would bring other problems, but that's another subject.
Right. It's interesting that this is the thing that everybody is terrified of. Fair enough, but I kind of think, yeah, that's the thing that we would need if we wanted them to be philosophical.
Well, Agnes, where's the politics in all this? You mentioned Aristotle as one of the three schools, along with the utilitarians and the Kantians. Of course, there's you studied and teach at the University of Chicago. You're all too familiar with the Aristotelian school of public politics, or of politics as essentially philosophy, as politics as the good life. Are you doing away with the political in your interpretation of the philosophical life and of Socrates?
Aristotle does not think that politics is essentially philosophical. Aristotle thinks that there are two ways to be happy. That is, there are two happy lives. And one of them, and it's the one that's sort of foregrounded in the Nicomachean Ethics, is the political life. And it's not a philosophical life. You do not spend it doing philosophy. You spend it doing politics, things like writing laws and, ruling in a just way over a city. You wouldn't have time for philosophy. And then he thinks, in addition to that, there's another life. And Aristotle actually thinks this one's a bit happier because it requires fewer external resources. And that's the life of the philosopher. It's not even philosopher, it's the contemplative life. It's the life of, maybe it's the scholar, maybe it's just someone who thinks about things. Okay, so I think Socrates' story is different from Aristotle's. I think that Socrates is integrating these things more than Aristotle does. That is, I think that Socrates thinks that our political encounters, our political interactions are defective insofar as they fail to imitate something philosophical. So if you want to know, why have we got so much polarization and politicization going on? Socrates will say, we're just not being inquisitive enough.
But that, and you correct me on Aristotle. I'm certainly anything but an expert here. But doesn't Aristotle argue, maybe let me revise the question, that our purpose is to be political, to participate in the decision making?
Says that man is a political animal.
Right. So man is a political animal. Your interpretation of Socrates, does it reject that?
Not exactly. So the biggest disagreement, the number one disagreement standing out among all of the disagreements between Socrates and Aristotle, is on the question, what happens when you die? So Aristotle thinks, well, when you die, that's it. Game over. Done. Okay. Your soul is eliminated, because your soul is just the form of the living body. So it doesn't even make sense to say that there's anything left over once you're dead. Socrates thinks, no, the soul is immortal. So what happens when you die is that the soul and the body are separated, and the soul kind of floats free of the body, and then maybe gets reincarnated, maybe goes on to live in the Isles of the Blessed. There are a lot of myths about what happens. Okay, this point of disagreement is very important for some other things that they think, because if you think, look, you got this one life and that's it, like Aristotle thinks, then you're much more likely to think that your whole life shouldn't be a infinitely goal far away self-improvement project. Aristotle thinks, yeah, work on yourself, aspire, try to become better until maybe the age of 35 or so, and then just kind of, live out who you are. Socrates thinks that the project of becoming perfect, of perfecting your soul, if it's going to take, a couple dozen lifetimes, no problem, but that's the worthy project to engage in. Now, we get to man as a political animal. So obviously there's one sense in which man is more directly political for Aristotle if the soul is not separate from the body, and the body is what's embedded in politics. And there's also a sense, so I think Socrates thinks that we human beings are deeply and fundamentally dependent on the people around us. And in that sense, human beings are political. And we can't think without other people. So we're thrown on the mercy of the people around us and their willingness to help us inquire and think. He thinks that he's much more convinced of our intellectual interdependency than Aristotle is. But so he would, when you say man, right, that's the word there is like anthropos, so it's like human being. The question for Socrates is a human being what I am? That is an embodied creature. Is that what I am? And I think Socrates would say, no, what I am is a soul. Now my soul is embodied at the moment. At the moment, it's got this like flesh clothing. But fundamentally, that's not what I am. So as an anthropos, as a human being, as an embodied creature, I am essentially political in a way that's maybe stronger than the sense in which Aristotle even thought. But there's also this possibility, from a Socratic point of view, of a disembodied soul that has complete knowledge.
Last year we had Matt Gayton on the show. He wrote a book on the shadows of Socrates, about Socrates' death. I was always taught, Agnes, and again, please correct me. You don't seem shy to correct me on these things. I was always taught that Socrates was given the choice of either staying alive and leaving Athens, or taking poison and choosing his own death. So he chose his own death because he didn't want to leave his community. Is that a fair interpretation? And what does Socrates' death, which of course is extremely well known and seems to epitomize, I don't know whether it's the philosophical life or a good life, tells us a lot about him. How does that feed into your theory of open Socrates?
So it's not quite correct. There are 2 points in his story that you might be referring to. One point is during the Apology. So this is Plato's texts that give us Socrates' speech of self-defense at his trial. Socrates makes a speech explaining why you shouldn't convict. I'm not guilty of corrupting the youth, of introducing new gods to the city, disbelieving in the gods of the city, and so on. So Socrates defends himself, and then there's a vote, right? Is he guilty or innocent? And he's voted guilty by just a little margin. And then he's asked, what punishment do you propose for yourself? So he's asked to propose a punishment. And here's a striking thing that happens. I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but he talks for a little bit. And after he talks, the jury votes to condemn him to death. And the numbers that condemn him to death are higher than the number that voted him guilty. So the thing he says after he's voted guilty, but before the jury has to vote on his punishment, is so annoying to the jury that they that more of them vote to kill him than thought that he was guilty.
But he was successful then, probably, in an odd sense.
Well, so what does he say? I mean, I think that he's sincerely in the first part trying to explain why they shouldn't convict him because he thinks he's innocent. But what he says is, no, I'm not going to propose banishment for myself. That is, maybe you would be okay with that, but I'm not going to propose it. Why would I think that people who, if you guys can't tolerate me, for instance, why would some other group of people tolerate me? And, if you ask me, well, why can't you just stop doing your Socrates thing? If I tell you the truth here, you're going to think I'm being ironic. He says, you're just not going to believe me, but the unexamined life is just not worth living. Okay, so that's one point where he basically refuses to propose banishment as a punishment for himself. What he proposes instead is free meals for life at the Prytaneum, at the cafeteria, basically. He's like, look, I think what you should punish me by, I've been doing this great service, so you should punish me by rewarding me with free meals. Right. So it's not that he passes up the opportunity. He's not offered the opportunity to leave. It's that he refuses to propose that as a punishment for himself. The other thing that you might be thinking of is that in the Crito, when Socrates is waiting in his jail cell, he's waiting to be executed. His friend Crito comes to him and says, Socrates, I've bribed the guards. We can escape right now. Let's go. It's time to go. And Socrates refuses to run away and escape. So that's also, it's not exactly that he was offered this alternative, like he's offered the possibility of breaking the law and thereby escaping. Okay. So I think that both of these things are supposed to reveal some things about Socrates. And I do agree that the death of Socrates is supposed to, Plato thinks we can learn a lot about Socrates from the death of Socrates. We know that because so many of the dialogues are about the lead up to, or the conduct of, or what follows the trial and the death of Socrates. There's like 5 of them.
So, but in your interpretation of Socrates, he could have left Athens and just done his thing somewhere else, could have gone to another city-state. There was nothing quintessentially Athenian about him, was there?
You mean before he was accused?
Well, yeah, they could have been exiled and then just gone off and asked questions somewhere else.
Right. I mean, he wasn't exiled though, right? So like that's a particular punishment. He didn't receive that punishment. So like, given that once he was found guilty, he didn't have any option of that. I think that what he would say to that is, I'm a citizen of the city that puts itself forward as being the place of free speech more than any other city in the area. And so this is where I have my best shot. And I think he was right about that. You know, we're talking about a time in history where traveling and being a foreigner is just not unproblematic. Not a thing people really did. Like, you're from somewhere, people don't know who you are, they kill you. So it's not like that was like a kind of easy road that was available to him. And he was already, again, from the city that was promoting, in some ways, free speech. The free speech city was Athens. And so I think, you know, until he was accused, he didn't have much reason to think he would have better luck elsewhere.
Yeah, and of course, this might be something that some people will be thinking about in Trump's America. 2 final questions, Agnes. You've been very generous with your time. You wrote an interesting thing in Unheard about Robert Musil's classic, although I'm not sure you would consider it a classic, The Man Without Qualities.
I consider it a classic.
But you described The Man Without Qualities as a man without philosophy. Someone who didn't know how to ask questions and so seems very confused. What's wrong with being without philosophy?
So what I think Musil's book is about is it's about how being without philosophy can be a real problem for a person. Which is not the same thing as saying there's something wrong with it for everyone. In fact, I think that's true, but that's not what Musil's book is about. Musil's book is about somebody not who doesn't know how to ask questions. That's not quite the right way to put it. The right way to put it is he doesn't dare or something, or he doesn't feel like he can move forward at all with those questions. He doesn't feel like he's going to get anywhere. And, you know, I wrote about how when I was reading Musil, I felt the same way. I was, you know, even though I loved philosophy from a young age, I did not major in it in college. I did not go to graduate school at first in philosophy. And the idea of calling myself a philosopher would have seemed preposterous. And I think it's like, well, look, there are these huge questions about the meaning of life. Am I really going to be the one who like figures that out? That just, it's hard to believe that could even be true. And so it's what Ulrich is sort of a philosopher who can't believe in himself. And that shows you, like, it shows you what a tortured life that is, of feeling like there are these questions that move you, that are the only possible questions that are worth attending to, but you also feel like there's no way I'm going to get anywhere with these.
So, and finally, let's end on a positive note. So, if Musil created a man in his Man Without Qualities, a man without philosophy, can you give an example, apart from yourself, of a man or a woman who we might all know who is leading a philosophical life? Do you have any models in the book or in your understanding of the world who we might, if not emulate, be inspired by? Because Socrates, as you know, died a long time ago.
I do give one in the book, but the person that I give in the book also died. He was a friend of mine, younger than me, and in fact, I recorded a conversation with him online. You can watch it on my YouTube channel, and it's a conversation about death, specifically about premature death. It's like a 3-hour conversation.
Did he know he was dying?
No, he died very unexpectedly, not long after that conversation. And I describe him in that chapter and what makes him a philosophical person, but also you can watch that video and see what a philosophical person looks like. I actually think my podcast interlocutor, Robin Hansen, is in his own way quite a philosophical person, and our exchanges are, quite Socratic in that we are not nice to each other. We don't agree, and we come at things from an incredibly different angle. And, in a way, if you want to know what you should emulate, maybe the lesson of my book is don't think about a person, think about an interaction, which is why I'm finding myself giving you, here's a video in which I'm talking to this person, or here's this kind of conversation. I think that when a conversation feels alive, when it feels like it has a kind of energy and momentum, it's often for these reasons. So I think that's the thing to attend to. That's the thing to emulate.
Well, Agnes Callard, the author of Open Socrates, it's already getting rave reviews, got a great review in the New York Times. I think it's already the best-selling book on Amazon. It's just out. You're going on the road, aren't you? In fact, you're coming to Berkeley next week. I won't be in San Francisco, unfortunately. You're going to be talking with Judith Butler. So you are actually doing or living the philosophical life. So how do people find out, Agnes, about this tour?
Follow my Twitter. At the moment, that's I should have a website, but I haven't been able to organize it yet. So I always put news for events on Twitter.
Well, Agnes Callard, I'd have to get you back on the show. In fact, you said you're going to go and see The Brutalist, American-Hungarian film. I'd be curious, since you're from Hungary, I'd be curious as your thoughts on that. Congratulations on the books, already very well received. Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life. It's about how to ask good questions. Thank you so much, Agnes.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.